Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us this morning. My name is Vicki DeBlasi. I'm the head of marketing at UK 5G, and we are here today to talk about how to build a business case for digital connectivity in places. We have got a great agenda for you this morning. So we are hearing from Bournemouth, Christchurch and Poole, and from the Greater Manchester Combined Authority, who will be sharing their experiences, the work that they are doing around business case development in both of their places, and sharing kind of best practice and potential banana skins to look out for. We'll then be running a panel session Q&A with Adrian, John and Sam. So normal rules apply for Zoom-based calls. Please do use the chat function if you would like to post any questions for the group as a whole, or for one of the individuals in particular. We do seem to be having a few technical issues with Zoom this morning. So if you're logged on and you haven't been automatically muted, please can you make sure that you mute yourself? I'll just give everyone a minute to do that now because I can hear a bit of background noise. So if you aren't automatically muted, please do so. Sarah, if you can please make sure that you keep an eye on that and just tag anybody that comes in late and just do that for us, that would be brilliant. Thank you. Okay, so without further ado, let's jump straight in. I am going to hand over control to Adrian Hale from BCP, who is going to get us started. Adrian, over to you.
Thank you, Vicky. I'm attempting to share my screen. I've got to remember where things are. Can you see my screen okay? Not yet, no. That isn't good, is it?
I can share it for you if that's easier.
It's working now. Is that working?
There we go. Yes, we've got you.
Good. Excellent. So yeah, my name's Adrian Hale. I head up the Smart Place team within BCP Council, and we've been working at Smart Places for the last 3 or 4 years, and we actually started off with a 5G project, but we've sort of like grown quite a lot since then, and our thinking has certainly developed enormously. So I'm going to be talking about where our thinking has got to, and particularly the elephant in the room, which is around funding of Smart Places, which includes 5G technology as well. So I shall meander through. The first thing which is important to say is that our program, after a few years of struggling with grant funding and everything else, you do realize that funding is the massive issue. And you think about, well, how do you actually get funding for staff? And the thing that really drives everything that we do is around value. If you can identify what the value is and what you're trying to do, then you're likely to be able to build a business case. So for us locally, we have to identify, well, what are the problems that need to be solved, the solving of which would then generate that value. So locally, we have significant social health and economic problems. We've got one of the oldest populations in the country, and it's getting older, which is great for old people. But it's an enormous burden on the NHS and on local authority services. And a lot of the things that we target within our Smart Place programme emanate out of our corporate strategy. So we do things like homelessness, security, traffic congestion, all the typical things that places suffer from. And those are the things that cause us a problem and that we're trying to solve. But beyond that, the normal things that local authorities do, we also have a £1 billion annual local productivity deficit compared to the national average. And so that is obviously holding our local industries back. And we estimate that of that £1 billion, probably about £150 million a year is a result of poor connectivity within the local area. The other thing that we see going on, which is a massive driver for change for us, is around value escaping the local economy. So even before COVID, the likes of Amazon and online transactions were beginning to destroy our high streets. So how can we actually reverse that? How can we actually help to maintain our funding and our revenues within the local economy to help boost local businesses? So that's a major issue for us. for all those local authorities on the call, you don't need reminding that there is significant pressure on public sector budgets. And one of the things that I'll be talking about is around statutory responsibilities. So one of the things is obviously there's not enough funding within local government at the moment. Everybody knows that most funding is going on adult social care and children's services, and there's little else available for the other services. And going back to COVID-19, obviously after the pandemic, is how do we recover from that? So those are just typical challenges that are facing us as a place, and what we're trying to do is to address those. So our Smart Place program, I say it's absolutely value driven. And what we look at, we started off by looking at the technology a few years ago, but you suddenly realize you come across this brick wall of funding, so you then have to go down the value line. So how do you create value? And what we are trying to do is to create smart place solutions to improve the lives of our residents, the vibrancy of our communities, and the prospects of our local businesses. So we have coined the phrase about being aggressively local, which is trying to retain that value within the local economy. And by focusing on the things that need doing, we hopefully can then deliver the business cases for the connectivity side of our Smart Place program. So like I say, we massively focus upon generating local value, and that is critical in terms of creating any business case. So I'd say people, business, communities, that's where we focus. So our program, to give you some context, we attempted to get some funding from DCMS a few years ago for the 5G testbed and trials. We've had a miserable run of trying to get grants from DCMS. We probably had 4 calls. We've been shortlisted 4 times. That's both on 5G and gigabit fiber. We never got the money. But one thing that happened is that the Dorset LEP supported the Lansdowne pilot project, which we ran about 2 or 3 years ago, and it finished last year. And as part of that project, we were able to stand up a standalone 5G network, which is probably one of the most advanced in Europe. But that of itself doesn't create a business case. And what's really important for us is that whole story about the place. What is our story? And so the next thing that we did, we then applied for Towns Fund funding from the Department for Levelling Up. So again, DCMS not involved, but all local based grants. And what we're doing is building on the work that we did in Lansdowne, and now we're developing the project in Boscombe. And so some of the things that we've done at Lansdowne and we will be doing at Boscombe include things like around augmented reality, which is actually running off of 5G around town centres to try to encourage people back to the town centres. We've also used our 5G technology in terms of how we can actually prioritise the highway network as well. But we use a range of technologies. It's not just 5G. So we've done things around assisted living. We've done things around security. And we've also done things around air quality as well. And if you want to look at any of the videos that we've created as a result of our programme, you can go on BCP Council Smart Place and you can see what we've been up to. One of the things I would also say is, as part of the democratic process, we did an awful lot of work around EMF monitoring, because when we started on our journey, there was a lot of kickback around the deployment of 5G nationally. So we've now got a real-time monitoring system for our network. But the big problem for us is that that's all right. You get your little pockets of grant funding. So we've got Lansdowne, we've got Boscombe, 2 areas of Bournemouth, but actually we want to roll out across the whole Bournemouth, Christchurch and Poole area. So how can we possibly do that? And that is not only with gigabit fiber, not only with 5G, but it's also with applications and services as well. And the biggest problem is, of course, is funding. So where do we get that funding from? And one of the critical issues is there's no statutory responsibility associated with smart places or connectivity. And I have raised this issue before because my background is in highways, and local authorities have a responsibility as local highway authorities to create local transport plans, and they get regular funding from DFT to be able to maintain those plans and develop those plans. So they have oversight of what is going on within the locality, and that is a properly funded program. But there is no statutory responsibility for local authorities or other public agency to look after connectivity or smart places. And for me, that's a massive missed opportunity. but that's obviously the climate in which we work. So therefore, in the absence of that direction, we realized, rather than trying to grab grant funding all the time, that we needed to tell our own story. So I attended one of the DCMS meetings, and I came out of it and thinking, actually, we need to tell our own story for the place. We need to understand what are the issues we're trying to solve, and how can we solve those, and how can technology help to solve those problems. And it's by doing that that you actually start creating value. And our program's still going strong. And what we ended up doing was to create an investment plan. So we created our Smart Place investment plan, and we recognized that government won't have a lot of funding moving forward post-COVID, and also with things that are happening in the world at the moment. And therefore, where will this funding come from? You know, other countries in the world, like in the Middle East and in China, they have the wherewithal to be able to just, you know, create smart cities and put in 5G technologies and gigabit fiber because they have the funding. But within the UK, it doesn't work like that. So we've created an investment plan. We're looking for £90 million initially of a private investment, and we are engaged with private investors, and they are very interested in our programme. And effectively, this is like a little bit of a map of how it works. You know, we get private investment on the left-hand side. Those elements go into a stack. So we don't look at 5G in isolation at all. It's all part of the digital stack, which consists of gigabit fiber at the bottom, 5G private networks, a data platform, a place-based data platform that we're working on. Because that goes back to the Amazon argument. Why do Amazon, Google, and Facebook know more about our places than we do? So we see data as being absolutely massive in the future. And then on top of that, what are the applications and services that we can run to make our places better and to help our local people and businesses to operate and to live more effectively? And the idea with that and having that focus is that you then generate value. And when you generate value, then that value can be then shared both between those people that invest in our program, but also back into the program itself, and also then back into community projects. So it's a bit of a circular economy thing that we've got going on, but that's what we're trying to do. That's our focus, and that's where we are. And that's my presentation. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you, Adrian. Really interesting and insightful kind of thoughts, and always great to hear from people who are actually there and at the front line doing it. I'm going to pass over now to John Stewart from Greater Manchester Combined Authority and Sam Lee from Transport for Greater Manchester, and they are going to share their journey and the way they're approaching business case development from a Greater Manchester perspective. And Sam, if that was your desktop, that was absolutely terrifying, the sheer volume of documents that you have on that. John and Sam, over to you.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, it's a bit of a double act on this. What I want to do is to give a bit of strategic overview as to what our thinking is on 5G and also really advanced wireless. So we don't consider 5G in isolation from what we're thinking about in terms of advanced wireless. And I think what was really interesting about what Adrian was saying there about creating value is dead right. And also there is this thing about government and I suppose the lack of recognition that connectivity should be considered to be a basic human right. You know, there's the fact that there's nothing statutory there to demonstrate the importance of digital connectivity to community, way of life, and economic growth. So there is definitely something in that. So what is our approach with wireless across Greater Manchester? So I'm the digital infrastructure policy lead for Greater Manchester. So I work really closely with the 10 local authorities and their leads in this area to coordinate and work with the private sector to help and support them and to help ensure that they deliver their local place needs, because as Adrian was saying, places are different and you need to appreciate how you actually respond to particular opportunities in places. So Greater Manchester was fortunate in securing 22 million in LFFN funding. which Virgin Media have been implementing. That network will connect 1,600 premises with full fibre, and that's going to be lit by the end of this year. So one of our thinking really is that how can we leverage this network using advanced wireless and 5G moving forward. We just led a contract also with Cisco, which is worth 10 million, which delivers services upon that network too. And the idea is to look at what do the delivery of advanced public service networks look like upon that programme. How can it support our wider objectives? Sam will be talking about what TFGM are doing specifically as well. So we've got this sunk investment and we're thinking, well, how do we drive the innovative services? How do we make sure that everybody can take advantage of digital connectivity, i.e. addressing digital inclusion? How can this drive inward investment and innovation as well? So it's got to be all of those four things. And the key thing at the city region level, you can do stuff at scale that's not actually possible at more local level. So very much our relationship with the local authorities is what makes sense to be done at city region level strategically. Well, we should do it, but shouldn't necessarily overlap with what the local priorities are. But in 5G and advanced wireless, there's definitely a strategic case to look at this at scale. So Sam, if you can switch on to the next slide. So what we looked at was how an advanced wireless program would cut across the key themes here around transport, digital inclusion, healthcare, and how we can and how we can work closely with the telecoms market, and how we can actually use data as well and manage data more effectively, building upon the sunk assets that we've got in terms of this single network infrastructure across the GMCA, and also street furniture assets as well, which are also across the 10 local authorities. So switch on to the next slide, Sam, that'd be great. One of the challenges with smart city applications really is that we've been faffing around with pilots for a long time, and not really looked at how we can scale this up. I think it's the nature of the market, because the market is not a stage where it's ready to invest yet, which is part of the reason for discussion. How can you create a business case that makes all this work? So if we move on to the next slide, what we're trying to do in Greater Manchester, and I think Adrian alluded to this too, is really use case stacking to look across energy, waste, water, telecoms and education, transport, and all these things to determine how best can we make our business case, not on these individual items, which is where the pilots come in, but the collective added value of these layers as you move through this from the technology through to the data and services and customer deliver. It's got to be integrated. We're having discussions now with our utilities about their investment, their digital investment across the piece. What's clear is that it's not coordinated all that well, and there is some challenges, I suppose, with the way in which utilities are regulated, which limits the amount of R&D that they can do. But we think there are perhaps routes by which we can look at working with the utilities much more strategically. We meet with them every couple of months anyway, and they're pretty well strategically connected, but on the digital agenda, there's room to improve that. And we think that, that can actually help the business case, because utilities need to monitor, well, in our case, Northwest Energy need to monitor their power consumption, for example, in relation to vehicle charging. They've got little SIMs in there to monitor power. We've got a big building retrofit program that's happening across Greater Manchester. We need to monitor energy outputs there too. So there's and the way in which water is managed across the city region too. So we think there's a significant opportunity around building use cases working with utilities. So if we move on to the next slide. So what we're looking to do is across Greater Manchester is leverage those assets we've talked about the LFFM program, One Network, the utilities, the fact that they are keen to work with us, and really build on those public use cases to drive that wider investment. But it does need to take advantage of the kind of ecosystem that we've got across Greater Manchester, and all the other initiatives around employment and housing sites, and working really closely with the local authorities around what does place mean to them. We've identified innovation zones across Greater Manchester and growth zones, which are intended to show the role of place in delivering growth. And what we want to do is overlay infrastructure to show how the digital infrastructure will actually help support those local ambitions. And the low carbon agenda is also huge for us. We've got zero net carbon ambition to deliver by 2038. How do we actually do that? We've got to have the digital infrastructure to monitor and help and manage the city region to help deliver those wider objectives too. And we need the mapping in place of all public sector assets and other in order that we can enable us to make better decisions. The next slide, would be great. We already know that, and Adrian alluded to this, a lot of other things that are happening across the world, and also within the UK that we can learn from. I think there's enough pilots that have been undertaken for us now to start to pull together, well, what's worked and what hasn't. Where are those big opportunities? Where aren't they? So, I mean, Sunderland has done its own big private 5G network to support Nissan. What can we learn from that in relation to some of the big industries that are across the country? How can private networks support key employment sites to drive inward investment? Liverpool have been doing some great stuff on health and social care as well. The lessons to be learned there, and also from other countries. So what we're looking to do is pull that together. So the next slide, Sam. And we know about the scale of investment and the fact that we'll unlock a lot of further opportunities. And if we go on to the next one, and you know, you've probably all seen this as how that relates really to how a city and city region can function, all the various opportunities around there, and how we can look at integrated solutions. So on the final slide, I think what our next steps moving forward, what we're looking to do is commission the business case for local authority consideration, rooted really around current spend on mobile and wireless connectivity. So if you're building a business case, as we did for our local full fibre networks, we were looking at existing spend, what our local authority currently spending on this, what's their future projected spend on this, and can we actually reduce those costs by working collectively. Similarly with the utilities as well. How can we work directly with the utilities? We recognise that there's probably a conversation we need to have with the regulator on that as well. The intention is that by September we'll finalise the brief for procurement for the definition of looking at how that business case works, with an idea of the commissioning that work in October and November, and really building on the sorts of stuff that sort of findings that Sam will talk about now through the TFGM and the work that he's done. So I'll just hand over to Sam to his bit.
Sorry, I need to do a bit of a switch to unmute myself. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Right, cool. So John actually stole a lot of my thunder, so I'll try and skip over potentially some of the key points I wanted to cover as a whole. But I think in my kind of bit, I'll cover a bit more around some of the key kind of learnings that we've identified through the demonstration of the pilots, and things that, as just, you know, other authorities and other stakeholders looking into this space should look out for and consider as we move forward. So we kind of looked at 5G Smart Junction project, which is DCN funded projects, as a bit of a springboard to 5G adoption, because at the point when we were writing the proposal, there were still not many kind of credible use cases. Everybody was still looking for the killer application, that one use case to rule them all type proposition, and we kind of identified that that's just not likely to be the case as the project develops. So we actually focus on other pillars to support adoption of this connectivity and enabling of use cases as a whole. So as John mentioned, Andy Burnham has highlighted that the time really has come that digital connectivity become a basic human right and ensure that people aren't excluded from either digital services that local governments are providing, access to education, or widely, in a post-pandemic world, employment, because everybody can now work remotely for a lot of roles. How do we ensure that is the case, that inclusivity and access is there? And is 5G the solution to that problem? That is as a public sector led proposition. I think more importantly, beyond just the citizens, there is a whole piece around wider economic benefits and development and deployment and new solutions to reduce costs for a city region as we tackle some of our strategic agendas moving forward. So I think I just want to touch on kind of some of the key points around what to consider when we are talking about developing this ecosystem. And I'll go into a bit more detail on what we've done within these key areas for our project. So developing kind of that partnership approach with working is increasingly now more important, especially for local authorities that are very revenue stretched. But there's definitely benefits of deploying solutions at the very local level for SMEs to showcase their credibility, for commercial partner to tie back to their social good initiative, as well as universities for kind of next generation of research, and more importantly, local stakeholders like charities that could benefit from these baseline connectivities and do things that they may not have considered previously. It's important to think about 5G beyond just like the connectivity itself and the use cases, as John kind of alluded to. Advanced wireless, it includes connectivity within buildings as well, which is a whole other problem that we're trying to tackle with. But it's thinking about those secondary kind of benefits that needs to be considered. So what are the cybersecurity implication for onboarding more and more devices on these networks? What is the digital architecture that needs to set up so that you do have that foundation for innovation for new use cases to be deployed? I think another one that really surprises us is around the skills and the capabilities of supporting deployment of these networks. It's still very light. Working with partners like Siemens, we help them to develop an understanding and learning of how these technologies can be deployed, but we need to do more to upskill that if we are to create ecosystems to support use cases. And all of this is trying to make public sector a smarter customer so that we can start considering what the art of the possible is and do things in a more cost-effective manner. But the aspiration for what we're doing in the 5G Smart Junction piece is around creating this blueprint that can be replicated at a local level as well as a national level. So I'll just quickly touch on this slide because it is really interesting that this whole model is flipped in terms of when we talk about connectivity and transport and what it actually means. I think there has always been quite a traditional thinking about building them in the right things in the right place, like schools, supermarkets, so people can get to it, or is it building the transport links, so that people can get to it? Now the question now shifted in post-COVID to start thinking about, right, what is the role of digital connectivity? And this is why 5G and kind of that foundation with fiber network is so critical and important. And then those are the key narratives, I guess, when we talk about use case hacking. It's not necessarily just about demonstrating what a commercial case could look like. It's about helping us reduce costs to achieving our decarbonisation target through our Smart Junctions project, or creating this living lab corridor that we can now deploy new use cases and solution at a much lower cost base so that people can come and plug and play. And it's attracting wider players to work in the Great Manchester ecosystem and looking at things in that holistic way. As I touched on, those wider considerations should be made on cyber. I would suggest, if you've not seen this already, to take a look at the Connected Places Cybersecurity Principles by DCMS and the National Cybersecurity Centre. They're doing a lot more work in this, but definitely something worth considering. But some of the secondary benefit through the projects are things such as this, where one of our partners, SME partner Weaver Labs, has developed a cyber scorecard to really understand the security nature of the network and how that needs to be set up to support new use cases to be implemented, and to understand, I guess, the cyber posture of different use cases moving forward and what they require to make sure they're not compromised, such as, computer vision cameras that could pick up data around people moving around in a specific nature. So how do we make that balance of opening up the network enough for innovation, while at the same time is secure enough to maintain various kind of requirements from our privacy and governance perspective as a whole? And John's touched on a lot of this, and I think we've all started to look in this space in terms of how all the use cases kind of join together. But talking about more in the transport context, we're starting to see increase in connected vehicles, you know, where these vehicles and cars like that have a lot of data within them. Increasingly with electric vehicles as well, you know, that data is critical, as John touched on, to make sure the network is available for them to be charged, you know, with the data that we collect from them, or how we can prioritize them through signals to reduce congestion and achieve our green agenda. I've got 3 more slides, and I know I'm overrunning slightly, but what we tried to do, what we tried to do with the 5G Smart Junction project is actually start in a very focused corridor in Greater Manchester, in this 1.5 kilometre. And what we've done is deployed a small cell Open WAN network on top of existing fiber connections that's there. But moving forward, we'll be transitioning this onto the full fiber network, the Greater Manchester local full fiber network, as John's touched on, that connects up 1,600 premises, but it also connects up 80% of our traffic signal infrastructure. So you can see this amazing opportunity to provide a connectivity corridor along these kind of strategic routes that we'll have in Greater Manchester, and provide connectivity benefits, not just to the corridor, to the road itself, but to the neighbouring houses and university campuses and other stakeholders along it. Yeah, sorry, I've touched on this a little bit, but yeah, it's 700 urban traffic control sites. It becomes really interesting how that becomes the bench living lab for us to showcase and test solutions and see how they would operate before lifting it directly and just dropping it in other places as things move forward with the one network deployment, and so on and so forth. I think just to kind of highlight that some of with the 5G Create project, we've had a lot of learnings from it in terms of how it works from a traffic signal perspective. But now coming towards the end of the project, we want to ensure that there is some legacy moving forward. So we've already accounted for kind of post-project additional year of ongoing support with the network. And what we're looking to do now is attract more use cases into that ecosystem, give them Greater Manchester as the living lab and the shop front to showcase to the rest of the world what those capabilities are. And for that is so much more valuable than just pure funding to some of these SMEs to get over that valley of death, the credibility of their proposition as a whole. And we're starting to see kind of interest in this sort of area to really just want to deploy there and help it. And it helps us in twofold. One, it increases the posture of Greater Manchester and being at that forefront of innovation. But it comes back to that point of making public sector aware of what the art of the possible is. What could we actually do if we had this all around the Greater Manchester region? And it really excites them to start thinking, actually, we can do this differently. We don't always need to just go back the same way we've done things. So in addition to planners as well, we're planning on doing a 1-year on session to share development and learnings for other local authorities. So it's something to kind of just look out for moving forward. I think the last thing I just want to touch on is with the project coming to an end, we will be hosting a physical event on the 26th of July in Manchester. We didn't want necessarily for the event to be people just walking on site and look at radios and cabinets. So the event will be held in city centre Manchester with a lot of panels and networking opportunities, really to keep the conversation going and you know, to just talk about some of the pitfalls and lessons learned that we've made. So there's a link within the slide, and I'll share it in the chat in a minute. But do come along and come and see what we've done today and sharing some of the horror stories that we've had in terms of deploying some of these solutions. Yeah, so that's it from me. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Great. Thank you so much, Sam and John. Amazing. Yeah, please do put the link to the Smart Junctions event in the chat, because I think probably quite a lot of people on the call would be interested and find that an insightful event to cover. So we are going to bring Adrian back on stage with ourselves, and we are going to jump straight into a Q&A and panel session. I'm really pleased to see that we have been having loads of questions coming through, some of them specific to individuals, some of them looking at, I think, relevant for all of the panel. So let's jump straight into those first, and then I've also scribbled down quite a few questions that I had from some of the topics and themes that we have discussed there. So Adrian, one for you first. How did you assess the impact of poor connectivity in your £1 billion local productivity gap?
Right, it's an interesting question. Unfortunately, as a local authority, BCP Council was made up of different local authorities. So it was actually Dorset, the former Dorset County Council, had a very good economic development team, and they were able to assess the economic deficit for all productivity, not just connectivity, across the region. And compared to the national average, we were running at a £1 billion deficit. They then did a little bit of work around telecommunications and came up with a figure. I did another bit of work, which was actually listening to what businesses were saying. So what local businesses were saying in terms of productivity, the three key drivers for them was poor transport connectivity, lack of skills locally, and poor digital connectivity. And we just estimated that of that £1 billion, that kind of made it about £150 million. And that compared very well with the figure that Dorset had come up with as well for the cost of digital connectivity. But like I say, that's compared, our lack of productivity is compared to the national average. So it might be that other places might be okay, but for us, that's the problem.
That's brilliant. Thank you, Adrian. There's a couple of questions here about whether or not we'll be sharing presentations. Yes, absolutely. We will do that afterwards. So we can certainly share those around or publish them on UK 5G and share with you all after this. Another question for you, Adrian. How did you go about testing and promoting the augmented reality that you have in place?
We tested it on our 5G network, so it is working. Ironically, we did an event the other day, and during the event, as always, it didn't quite work properly. So, which is a bit of a shame. It's always the way, isn't it? But yeah, I mean, what it does, it actually uses. I mean, to be honest, it could use 4G connectivity as well. Like most of these things, it can use legacy technologies as well. 5G just gives you a better experience when it works. We just had a problem on the day. We haven't promoted it big time because, like I say, that was actually part of the Lansdowne pilot. But Boscombe, which is one of the most deprived areas in the country, we're going to be doing something very similar. So what we actually had was like dolphins swimming around roundabouts. So you put your phone up and you can see dolphins swimming around the roundabouts. So we're going to be doing, I don't know whether it be dolphins or what wildlife we'll use, but we're going to do something similar for Boscombe to try to attract people back to the high street in Boscombe as well. But like I say, Lansdowne was basically a pilot. Boscombe is a demonstrator, so we will then promote it more widely and people can see what we're up to.
Brilliant. Thank you, Adrian. Rick's put an interesting comment for doing 5G in the chat that, you know, eye-opener, Adrian, that grants are fine and dandy, but they build dependence and not sustainability. And I think that's a really interesting point. And John, obviously, you know, you talked about the fact that, you know, we've done lots of pilots. We need to move now about how we move from pilots to scale. And I just wanted to kind of open that up to the group to see, you know, what your thoughts on that are and how important grants are and how they do potentially impact long-term sustainability.
I would absolutely say it depends on the nature of the grant. So the interesting thing is that our funding has come from place-based programs, so from the Dorset Lab and also from the Levelling Up fund. I cannot overestimate or over explain the power of places. You know, places create the market, and that's what we are sat on. And if you want to create a sustainable business model, you've got to involve places. It is as simple as that. And I think anything else, you'll end up with suboptimal outcomes. And that's what we do. We focus aggressively on what is required in the local place. and we build up from that route, and we're building slowly, but we're building sustainably. You know, the grant funding is just that. And sometimes the grant funding can actually divert you from what the place needs, and you're actually diverting resources away from what should be your key focus for the place. And, you know, if I was to say anything to anybody, focus on your place and the value that you need to generate. Don't worry about the tech, work on the problems, and then the tech comes afterwards.
Yeah, can I just add to that, Vicky? I think I completely agree. Like the tech is a means to an end. I think sometimes with a lot of these innovation projects, it's tech looking for a problem to solve, which is a very dangerous kind of place to go. I would say though that grant funding allows local authorities to explore things that are traditionally more risky and things that we don't understand. I think so. Like the 5G Create program has generated so much kind of learning and insights on what the art of the possible is that would have probably cost individual authorities a lot of money to do and taxpayer money to do. And actually on the other side, it helps the market understand what are the gaps in terms of what we're doing at the moment. So as I mentioned, you know, working with Siemens quite closely in terms of the deployment of the 5G network, you know, they're now starting to think, actually, we need to upskill our guys in terms of this area of connecting up fiber, deploying 5G network. If this is the future, you know, what are the programs that we need to be placing as a business to support that moving forward? So I would say that there's a piece that the grant enables us to move things on, and is a lot easier to see what it looks like if it's physically in the ground rather than in the slide deck and so on and so forth. And also it forces, I guess, commercial operators to think about things differently and do things differently as a whole. So I think it's critical. I think the gap, as always with innovation projects, legacy, right? It starts and then it finishes, and then how do you keep it going? And as I say, this is what we're trying to do, that the network itself will be funded through internal kind of funding as a whole, because but what we're trying to do is attract SME to the network and deploy as a whole. So can we start generating kind of fees potentially from these SME? In the ideal scenario, we'll make it cost neutral, and we don't, because we'll benefit so much just from the learning alone. But it's that fine balancing that and starting that conversation going on what is acceptable to commercial partner and what isn't. John, is there anything you want to add from that side?
Yeah, just to kind of extend that a little bit. I think grant funding works best when it seeds things that ultimately can be sustainable. So a good example might be that grant funding to enable us to undertake a joint piece of work with utilities across Greater Manchester, for example, where, you know, we're able then to look at a joint program of activity, looking at advanced wireless connectivity, or it could be something around the development of advanced wireless meshes to address digital inclusion in particular areas too. You know, it has ultimately got to be sustainable. The advantage of seeding something with grants is that it gives you time to develop partnerships with the private sector as well, which is otherwise difficult. You know, the attraction of funding just enables you to start to cement things. Good example of where when you've actually got a mature relationship with the market, you can start to do things without money. So we've started, a good example of that in Greater Manchester is where we've been working with the 5 biggest internet service providers in social housing to look at what model would be sustainable in social housing to address digital inclusion. And they've all approached differently because they've got different kind of structures, but because we developed trust with all the internet service providers over the last 3 or 4 years, they're going to do this and it's not going to cost any money. All we need to do is kind of put a little bit of coordination in there, and at the end of the day, we'll build up an evidence base that we can go to government to say, well, look, you know, this element is sustainable in terms of digital inclusion, but we need to intervene in such places. So it's an evolution. So the intervention really needs to be about seeding it to enable us to do something at scale.
Yeah, brilliant. That's great. And we've had a pointed question in the chat then, which I'm going to use as a follow up to that, and which is, how are you going to cover future operational costs now that the project, so I think we're specifically talking about Smart Junctions project there, is coming to an end?
That's a difficult one. It's always difficult to
Yeah.
keep things funded and going. I think at the moment we see a cost benefit on deploying just the smart junction use cases, and then as I mentioned, for the next year, we want to get additional use cases on top of that, so that the cost bases start leveling out between number of different kind of propositions as a whole. I think we'll know in the next year that how many use cases we need to get to a break-even point. But I think one of the key things I want to stress actually is that with all the 5G creates projects, we're at the very forefront of deploying this sort of technology. So the cost basis is much higher than if it did become, common and ubiquitous as a whole. And not having one of the big manufacturers in the ecosystem also had an impact, but we've worked our way around it. And things like the chip shortage, that's had a massive impact on all sorts of industries as a whole. So we actually foresee like future deployment for networks to go down in costs, but in reality, the operational costs of the 5G network is actually almost non-existent, because we'll be using our network on top of a public sector fiber network, which is the LFFN. So it gives us almost a publicly owned 5G network in Greater Manchester to kind of not compete, but maybe coordinate and cooperate with other operators on to avoid overbill.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. There's a couple of interesting questions that I want to kind of dive into as well. And it's actually one of the things that I'd also noted down as a question. So we've had a question through from Matthew saying, completely agree that more investment needs to be made in ensuring that people have access to digital connectivity. However, would there be more of a business case for local authorities to focus on ensuring that all people within their region have decent connectivity, so allowing them to access growing number of council services delivered online, etc., rather than the gold-plated and therefore more expensive to deliver 5G or fiber, which isn't necessarily needed for the delivery of public services, i.e. ensuring everyone has something rather than improving connectivity for those already connected. And we've also had a comment through from Dean, which kind of takes that from another angle, but I think also builds on the same thing of saying, 5G, especially with high performance capabilities, won't work properly indoors without dedicated coverage systems. Good for things like roads, junctions, but in building applications will be patchy at best. What strategy are you promoting for indoor sites? And I guess one of the things I wanted to kind of pull out is, how important is it to make sure that we don't just look at 5G in isolation, that we do look at the round, we look at the best technology to fit the business case and to fit the needs and to fit the, the realities of, are we looking at indoor coverage, outdoor coverage, what the need is?
Perhaps I can just come in there on the issue of making sure that everybody got minimum coverage. In Greater Manchester, we've got floor targets now so that with ambition to make sure that nobody is below 30 megabit per second within 2 years. It's about how many premises it is about. It's not that many in terms of percentage, but it's really important so that everybody feels connected with that. And also, there's a significant role, as I alluded to before, in 5G connectivity directly addressing and wireless directly addressing digital inclusion challenges as well. If we do it right, and if the public sector is able to initiate opportunities, particularly around those areas where it control, like social housing and other things. So I do think there's a significant role for that, and we shouldn't lose sight of it. The big fluffy, the exciting, innovative stuff should be done at the same time as us looking at the getting our basics right as well. And certainly that's of particular concern at local authority level with the cost of living crisis. A lot of people are going dark now because they can't actually afford to connect digitally. What are we going to do about that as part of the public sector? We cannot afford for people not to have digital connectivity. What is the basic connectivity that public sector should do? And finally, some people will be aware on this call around the public service telephone switch off in 2 years' time as well. That's going to create a huge problem with digital exclusion and something that needs to be addressed directly, actually by government. They're putting onus on industry at the moment, but that means that nobody trusts what you're getting industry speaking to business and people, but there's no trust there because I think they're trying to sell them something. So that's another big issue that I think should drive, advanced wireless and 5G strategies to help address some of those gaps in connectivity.
Brilliant, thank you. Lots and lots of people on the chat saying that particularly interested in understanding kind of those conversations with social housing internet providers, interested in seeing those proposals for digital inclusion, interested in seeing economic models. So I think if there are things that you guys can share and are happy to share with attendees, I think that would be very much appreciated. One of the things that I also wanted to ask is somebody had put something in response to one of the answers yesterday, if I can just find it. Okay, so somebody's saying, I'm not sure I necessarily agree that the deficit to average productivity can be that easily applied to digital. Cheshire and Warrington has above average productivity, but arguably a deficit due to poor connectivity. And it's one of the things that I wanted to pick up on your presentation, John, is that you had that great slide that showed kind of lots of places in the UK and overseas and talked about sort of economic benefits that those places had attributed. Obviously, every place is different. That's the nature of the beast. To what extent do you think it's possible to take kind of benefits that have been sort of identified in one place and plug them into a business case for another place? How transferable are those benefits, do we think?
I think you can learn from elements of them. Nobody can replicate what Sunderland have done, I don't think, because of the nature of the scale of business and what Nissan actually do. But what you can do is look at private networks, maybe on a smaller scale, and we can see this beginning to happen on some of our key strategic employment sites where we're getting inward investment interest. They're not easily transferable. I think some of the stuff that Liverpool have been doing on health is going to be transferable. There's a lot of talk about virtual wards now. And some of those have been piloted across the UK. Certainly, those kind of things I think would be transferable across all spaces. And basic utilities. Everybody needs to have access to basic utilities, and all those utilities need to be better managed and monitored to deliver low carbon objectives. But as I said, all places are different. But I think there's some common generic areas where all places can work on together.
Brilliant, thank you. Adrian, Sam, anything you want to add on that one?
But I mean, the business cases, I say, it's all about your audience, really, isn't it? If I'm writing a business case to government, then basically I just reflect the figures that they put into the documents back to them and say, look, if you think this is going to create this amount of value, then if you do this for BCP, then basically this is what the value is of this project. When you're speaking to investors, it's a different story. It's a completely different story. And, and our focus is actually not tech investors necessarily, because they just bring their historical solutions. And sometimes you want some innovation around the funding just as much as you want innovation around the technology as well. So sometimes separating out the investment from the technology isn't a bad thing. Otherwise, you just get the same old, same old. And so, yeah, that's something I say. I can't say too much because we are still in those investor conversations at the moment. But if people want to speak to us, there's a lot more to our program than I've shown today. If people want to speak to me privately, I can tell them about what else we're doing. But certainly, those investor conversations are really important, and it is quite interesting. You speak to investors, and they have a completely different view of the world than most people do. And and if you speak to the right type of investors, they love it, because they want to do good. The good investors want to do social good as well. And the secret is to tap in to how you can both share those benefits. So I think one of the things that I would emphasize, and I think John has mentioned it already, the private sector on its own isn't going to solve this problem. The market will only ever go where the market wants to go. If it's not viable, then who looks after the not spots? But the public sector with the private sector can massively enhance outcomes. And that is really, really important. And that's what we've been focusing on. And if you can understand the added value that is generated by the private and the public sector working together, then you will probably end up with securing investment.
Yeah,
Sam,
I think just Yeah, John, do you want to go?
All I was going to do is mention the word social value to add to what Adrian point, really. So we've been able to extract substantial social value from the LFFM program, probably about £500,000, and the One Network, about £3 million worth of social value on the back of that, which helps support other things. So through procurement, we can do these kind of things, but also through, a more informal relationships, you can deliver added value too. So I'll hand over to Sam at that point.
Yeah, so just kind of segueing onto the social value point, I think from a company's perspective, increasingly more important, and brand presence and that perception of what they're doing, in the local ecosystems and supporting, the most vulnerable is a key part of their kind of image moving forward. And a lot of people are choosing organizations to work on depending on that, which is actually quite interesting. I just want to quickly circle back around that productivity piece. I think we fall into this, and this is my personal view, just the caveat. I think we fall into this pitfall a lot of times that we build something and productivity is the measure of success. Like we want to create more productivity. What does that actually mean as a whole? I think with the kind of digital, more importantly, is less about the productivity, but more about creating opportunities for the future and making a level playing field for others in terms of accessing services and education and everything else. And it's starting to look at things in that holistic way. So productivity tends to BAYS or DCMS in terms of funding, right, as a whole, when we think about digital connectivity infrastructure. But actually, if you put that in the transport context, could we build fiber instead of building a road? Does that actually provide a wider kind of value in return on investment? How do we balance those kind of agendas moving forward? And it's starting to think about it in that way, that it's not things in specific silos, how they work almost seamlessly together to support the growth of a city, of change of people's lifestyles. I think just a quick anecdotal point, in Greater Manchester, since the lockdown, we've seen an increase in people living here but working in London because they can, due to the connectivity and the lower cost of the lifestyle costs. They can live a lot better lifestyle up here than maybe somewhere further down the south. So that connectivity is going to change the way of how cities are designed, and the importance of location for employment, especially for kind of the digital and the high skill sectors. And there'll still be kind of challenges around the other sectors as a whole, but it's just starting to think about all those things in that holistic way.
Brilliant, that's great, thank you. A few more interesting questions that have come in that I'd like to put to you guys. So could network build out be funded by a house building / regeneration levy and advertising?
Right, yeah, well, there's been a lot of talk, I think, around Section 106 and community levies, and looking at the elevated value of land once it gets planning permission. It makes a lot of sense, and the thing that really frustrates me, I suppose, around digital networks is the fact that there's a challenge in that one digital network is seen to be enough for places, and when really you need competitive infrastructure in every place, so that residents and communities have got choice, and housing developers need to reflect that. I suppose it is possible that you could actually put in within community levies elements of having the necessary digital infrastructure to kind of support the monitoring of carbon outputs for particular housing areas. I do think a low carbon agenda is going to drive a lot of innovation around how digital infrastructure is used, because we're going to have to monitor everything, and digital is you're going to need the infrastructure to do that, both fixed and mobile. I don't know whether that answers the question.
Can I just add to that a little bit? So kind of John touched on the decarbonisation agenda. I think another trend we're starting to see in TFGM is EV charging infrastructure provision and building of those linking to fibre connectivity. So I think one of the companies, I think you might be Connected Curbs, that are working with Virgin Media to lay the two side by side. Now, if that exists, what are the advanced wireless opportunities on top of that moving forward? Could every charging point be a small cell? You know, so it opens up actually some really interesting discussions and how we kind of position ourselves and how these systems are built to enable other people to access it, and so that, you know, we're not wasting that capacity.
Yeah, brilliant. A couple of others have come through which sort of take us into the territory of DCIA, which for those on the call who might not be familiar is the Digital Connectivity Infrastructure Accelerator. It's a bit of a mouthful. That is a program that's being run by DCMS that is looking specifically at how we can advance or accelerate the deployment of digital connectivity through using publicly owned infrastructure, so things like street furniture, bus shelters, street lights, etc. So a couple of questions on that I want to put to the group. So digital connectivity needs digital data and technology. What investments are needed in asset data management and data platforms?
So we've looked at this. It's massive investment in data platforms, but it's almost like it's going to happen. You know, it's actually part of our stack. So one of the things that we're speaking to investors around is the ability to build a data platform. You then get into all the issues that we've spoken about before about cybersecurity and everything else. But it has to happen because, as I said in my presentation, there's so much value escaping the local economy at the moment. If we knew what our places, how our places were operating, you know, that information can be shared with the public sector. It can be shared with the private sector. Businesses can connect far more effectively locally. It then has sustainable outcomes as well. So data is massive, and I've forgotten what we estimated that we would need, but we were probably looking just to start things, you know, is about £30 million, but there is so much to do. And actually, it's one of the things that we've looked at in quite a lot of detail, and we've concluded that this is something that we need to work with other local authorities on. Because unlike fiber and other infrastructure, you can't move that from authority to authority. But if you can build a local place-based data platform, that technology can easily be transferred. And actually, from a cybersecurity perspective, it's actually far better, because having cellular structures around the country of different places having their own platforms with data, just taking information to other places, that is going to be far more secure than trying to have a one-size-fits-all, either regionally or nationally. So this is something, the architecture around it, how you build it, you know, so it's something that we're looking at in a lot of detail. And it is data more than anything else that is going to drive the financial aspects of any smart place program. That's absolutely not, it won't be the connectivity, it will be the data.
Sam, John, you're both kind of nodding your heads at that. You agree with that sentiment?
John, do you want to go first?
No, you go first.
So, I mean, the DCIA program is great. We've been keeping an eye on some of the early outcomes and some of the successes and kind of lessons learned. And as Adrian touched on, data is a big piece. I think just on that data piece, historically, we just do things once and forget about it. We capture the data and then just sit somewhere. I think the bigger question is, how do we keep it up to date? How do we generate wider values for it to keep it up to date for other use cases and other applications as a whole? That has always been the challenge, in my view, because you can go to get to data, but it's probably 3 years out of date, or things has been changed, or the door's not even there, whatever else, right? As a whole, in terms of, so that, I think that's one side of it when we're talking about DCIA and infrastructure. The other side of it is all the legislation and the various kind of commercial agreement that local authorities already have that puts a spanner in the works. So PFI is a good example on lighting columns. You know, if a lighting column service provision is provided by a PFI from Amy or whoever, it's very difficult to get any small cell or 5G equipment on top of that. So there's a question of how we become smarter with that sort of stuff moving forward, and what consideration we need to make around those clauses when we do build kind of infrastructure. I think the last thing to add on the DCIA side of things is that key piece around how we build a way for people to easily understand where the assets is. So whoever the stakeholder is, whether or not it's telco, you know, people that want to deploy network, and what that pathway to getting access to it is, because you can see it on the map, you can see the data, but right, I want to deploy something. What do I do now? What is that kind of single seamless pathway to support that? How do we ensure that that's open as well, so other people can see what's been deployed? Because there may be value around, oh, I didn't know this new small cell network has been deployed there. On top of this, I have a use case that can be used for this. So is that back and forth of discovering of assets for deployment of new infrastructure, as well as then new use cases to deploy on those networks that for the local ecosystem as a whole. So those are the bits I would say are going to be critically important. John?
Yeah, I think so. I think you've answered that question pretty well. I think from our side, Greater Manchester done some really good mapping of its assets and did it working with the Cabinet Office some years ago. We were really looking to build on it through DCIA, but unfortunately we're unsuccessful in that. But from a planning perspective, you have to know where your assets are anyway. And what concerns me is that many local authorities, perhaps on this call, haven't had the opportunity or the resources to actually map all their assets and understand where they are and where those opportunities might be. It is a great example of this thing of it's pointless having to bid for money when actually, in fact, there's a generic need for this kind of stuff across all local authorities. Because it makes it work more efficiently in terms of dealing with the private sector and investment opportunities. It's mad that you just had 8 DCIA projects when in actual fact everybody needed a slice of the action.
Yeah, and I think Anthony's kind of put some interesting comments just on this conversation. So there's often a political element for those sites as well. Absolutely, talking about the fact there's a lot of variation in the local authority asset mapping sophistication, which is absolutely also true. So I think for those people who aren't that familiar with the DCIA program and the work that's been done there, I'd encourage you to have a look on the UK 5G site. If you use the search function, just search for DCIA. We have a dedicated page on it, and that program has a quite strong dissemination focus on it, because to your point, John, this is something that every place up and down the country is struggling with to a certain degree or needs to have a grasp on. So I think it's definitely worth looking at that. And it's definitely worth keeping an eye on that page, because we will be bringing information through. So Anthony's saying that he's on the project that West Sussex are one of the pilots. We had a dissemination event that we ran in Bristol last week for that, and some really interesting work coming out of that. One of the work streams is about PFIs, as you mentioned there, Sam. All of the pilots were presenting there and were sharing really kind of valuable sort of insights and questions. Ian, is there a rural DCIA pilot? Yes, Dorset is one of the DCIA pilots. They're doing really interesting work, and actually through the 5G Rural Dorset project, they'd already actually started doing a lot of this work around mapping assets. So they are kind of motoring on their DCIA pilot. They were talking last week, and I think this kind of goes back to the point you were making, Sam, around it's not just about building a platform that's got data around what assets there are and where they are, but layering across that contextual data to help you really understand, what is the actual accessibility of those assets, what are the other elements and considerations that you might need to bring into those discussions. So very interesting work being done by those. We are going to be publishing probably towards the end of next week a write-up of that event on the UK 5G site, so definitely worth having a look out for that. So thank you for those questions. I think I've covered most of the ones that have come through in the chat. If people have got other ones, please do continue to throw them in. There's a couple of questions that I wanted to kind of pick up on based on your presentations. So the first one, and John, you kind of very clearly articulated this in your presentation around the fact of, we need to bring people together. You need to combine the different sort of use cases, combine those benefits and create the kind of cohesive business case. Something we're talking about a lot now is this idea of stackable use cases. Sam, you yourself said there is no one killer application that's going to make your business case. So I suppose I have two kind of questions on that. One, what are the teams that actually need to be involved in thinking about that? And secondly, bringing lots of people together sounds all very good in theory, but in practice, we all know that can be quite difficult. And actually, have you got any questions or any advice, I suppose, or insights for our audience today around how you can kind of best manage that in practice?
Perhaps, shall I kick off on that?
Yeah.
One of the things that we learned in Greater Manchester is that nothing really works unless you build an ecosystem to support it. That takes time. You can't do it instantly. What you have to do, for example, with the utilities, it's probably taken about 5 to 10 years, I suppose, to build those relationships, but you've got to start somewhere and you've got to build that kind of sense of trust. The market, perhaps more recently, maybe over the last 3 or 4 years, we've been building that, and of course that takes capacity to actually manage and keep those relationships going. It also takes, I suppose, some element of consistency of people staying in place to actually do that. So you need almost this perfect scenario where you've got all of these happening, so you can actually build your ecosystem. But the challenge is, without that in place, you can't really achieve all that much. So my recommendation would be that, I think Adrian alluded to this, is where you can have local authorities actually working collectively to share what expertise and specialisms they've got. It's probably going to be more effective. The other thing that we've been looking at across just over the last year or so is secondments from industry, the extent to which we can work directly with industry by having somebody from industry getting an inside track into what the public sector is thinking. So we did that with Virgin Media. So Virgin Media actually sit inside our digital inclusion team now. There's a secondee who just keeps staying. He was on a six-month secondment, and it's now like 18 months. And the reason for that is that Virgin Media see tremendous value in understanding what's going on at a local level. So another example is TalkTalk. So they are looking to second somebody within on the kind of employment side, employment charter side, to better understand how their business can better respond to some of the social challenges there. And I think, depending on who is based within your local authority, starting up conversations around, the opportunities for businesses to get a little bit of insight into public sector thinking is something that is of value to them. And I would urge people to kind of explore that.
Yeah, I think just to add to John's point, I think secondment is actually, really interesting, right? They're getting some benefits from it. I think we're starting now to talk to kind of central government departments as well, around rotation between them and local authorities, and getting them to understand, the challenges we face. Now, and I think, Vicki, you probably experienced this. In Manchester, we do things differently, rightly or wrongly. And it's all about developing partnerships and working with people. And when we talk about developing those use cases, I think the recommendation I would say is, don't necessarily go and try and develop the proposition at those directors levels. Really work with people that are the coalface of all of this, that really struggling with the challenges day in and day out, because they will be the people that will want to drive a lot of the solutions forward and will push their bosses to make it happen, because they see a wider social good in that proposition. So I guess that's one angle. And I guess the other angle is making sure you're bringing citizens along the journey. As Adrian was trying right from the start, it's not tech for tech's sake. If we bring them along and educate them on what the art of the possible and why we're doing something, we slowly move that needle along, for them to understand the value and for them to be asking for something like this, because they can't ask what they don't know. Ask for something that they don't know the benefits of. So it's starting to change that narrative as we go with wider education as well.
Thank you. Yeah, Adrian, coming to you then.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it sounds obvious, but it's having a vision and an ambition. What is it you want to do? And what's so interesting is that the conversations we've had with big companies, with little companies, with other, with investors or whatever, is that there'll be some companies that come with their business models of old. This is what we've done in the past. But if you as a place understand what it is that you want to achieve and what your vision is, then some of those companies will disappear and other companies will say, no, actually, we get what you're trying to do. And it's those companies that you want to work with, because they know they're going to have to revisit their own business models. And they realize that actually, if we work alongside, like I said before, private sector, public sector, we can actually generate greater value. And we always talk about increasing the size of the pie. And you find, like within the private sector, you've got all these people delivering all these different technologies, and you think that's brilliant, but someone else is doing it. And is it what we need? The thing is that local authorities, they know what the issues are. So they therefore know the value and the problems to be solved. And therefore they have the keys to the solutions. And it's if you build value adding solutions, that's what's going to be viable, and exactly what we've been talking about. And it applies to government to some extent as well. There's a real need to get under the skin of what local authorities are about and what the local issues are that people face day to day, because within that is the gold that will generate the viability for every business case. And that's where we're going to get to.
Brilliant, thank you. We just had a question come through from Maria. I was wondering if any of the speakers have any valuable lessons, best practice to share in terms of involving the VCS sector in any of their work, in the same way they have shared learning for working with investors.
Is that the voluntary sector?
Good question. I'm not sure. Yes, it is. Yes.
So bit of background. So I'm a peer reviewer for the Local Government Association, and I actually did a peer review of Wigan Council a few years ago. And it's actually this work that I did with Wigan that actually inspires a lot of what we do now. So Wigan were facing a massive deficit of about, I think, a budget cut of about 50% of their budget. This is about 2008. And they created something called the Wigan Deal. And what they did there, they actually basically, they were managing expectations with the public, but also what they were saying is, rather than the public being almost like the recipient of the services, lots of those communities and voluntary sector can actually be part of the answer as well. And one of the massive things, and this isn't about 5G, it's not about even digital connectivity, although it's there, it's about how do you empower your local communities to be able to play a really active role in solving community-based problems. And it's a massive focus for what we do within our Smart Place programme. And I got some lovely anecdotal stories about how the voluntary sector has been benefited from what we are doing, and how that then, councils have got a massive funding shortfall. And one of the key things is about how do you keep demand coming in either into councils or into the NHS? How can you deal with preventative measures and things like this? Massively important. And if you get the community sector involved, get the voluntary sector involved, these are people that are willing to work with you, and they can deliver enormous value. And certainly a massive aspect of our programme is tapping into that resource and making sure that we get the greatest benefit from it. And that's a world away in some respects from 5G technology, but it's all part of the ecosystem that you need to have in order to deliver successful places.
I totally agree with that. Just to refer back to the social housing pilot projects that we're doing across Greater Manchester, what we're testing there is the extent to which there's place variation in terms of. So what we're looking to do is define the role of the internet service provider, social housing provider, local authority, and the voluntary sector in addressing digital inclusion within social housing. We know there's going to be variables there, but through that work we'll determine the capacity and role of the voluntary sector and that capacity within those pilots. And we suspect that could be substantial, and if properly channeled, that can get better value for the local economy, and also maybe mean that there's you target. Any government intervention is much more effectively targeted as well through understanding that, because it may well be, it's like this seeding thing again. What you don't want is something that's not sustainable. You want to create stuff that ultimately funds itself in the end. And the value of the voluntary sector in helping to find solutions is severely underestimated, I think, in this country.
Yeah, I think just to add to John's point, in the Greater Manchester Compound Authority, and John's colleague has kind of been running this Greater Manchester Digital Inclusion Task Force, and it works with kind of local communities, charities, and VCSs, in terms of key challenges they're having, and kind of use cases that they're developing that's solving some of those problems. So using networks like that actually just to start sharing the story and sharing the problems helps a lot in terms of getting an understanding on that wider picture. Because with delivery, sometimes we're just so tunnel vision, we don't see, the wider impact of some of the things we're doing. Just a high level things like automation. In practice is great, but from an economic and societal perspective, if not the right levers aren't in place, it could be devastating. So what are the considerations we need to make on that? I think the final thing from a more use case specific perspective to look at with the Smart Junction project, what we're actually doing is with the computer vision camera, we're focusing on the most vulnerable road users rather than your traditional cars or buses or lorries as a whole. So cyclists, e-scooters, pedestrians, and people. Also, the camera allows us to identify people with accessibility needs. So we have been speaking to those kind of stakeholders in terms of how would you use this solution? Because as a sighted person, we might be making other assumptions that we're not fully aware of. So it's a bit of a two-way. Those becomes a bit of a two-way exercise where they come and show us what their problems are, and we learn and become more aware of their kind of considerations and things they look at, and then with amend the proposition to deploy and see how that changes. So it's building those partnerships and having these iterative conversations of solutions and deployed and rolled out, and keeping the dialogue going rather than just doing it once and forgetting about it.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you. Really interesting answers in there. So we are nearly at the top of the hour, and there is one question that's just come through in the chat that I want to ask, and then one question I wanted to kind of finish on. So the question that's just come in: what advice can you give to businesses to work around and work with local authorities when there are numerous departments involved when trying to access assets? So planning, legal, commissioners, finance, etc. Who wants to take that one for me?
Maybe. Perhaps I'll kick off, because there's a great anecdote, I suppose. When we started our local full fibre network, we looking to submit a bid to government on it and implement that. We recognised that we needed to contact all those various departments within the 10 local authorities too. And the real challenge, as I think is alluded to in this question, is that a really steep learning curve to understand how the digital sector works, and you needed a champion within the local authority to articulate that. But until you've got that, it is really difficult. We started with IT people within local authorities, but the way in which we solved the problem was that we went to the chief executives and say, you're going to have a lead on this, otherwise we're stuffed, and that is the only way you could do that. So you had a lead that actually brought those key people together, because exactly those, and planners and highways and finance and legal. That's what you got to get together. So just being able to coordinate that with one person is essential.
Brilliant. Yeah.
So I'll just quickly jump in on that. I think on a day-to-day basis, I get bombarded by different people that want to work with Greater Manchester, Transport for Greater Manchester, and deploy their technologies. The advice I always give to people, if you are working with local authorities and kind of public sector stakeholders, is don't go to them with a sales pitch. Go to them to say how they fit into your product journey as you're developing it. And the local authority as a stakeholder to support you in terms of validating the solution and helping educate the public sector what the proposition and the value is for what you're developing. So don't see us, because we're always very cash-strapped already as the end customer, but see us as a critical advisor that can help guide your solution and help you find commercial sustainable propositions for it as a whole.
Brilliant. That's a great answer. So final question, and I'm going to come to each of you in turn, is just, we've had tons and tons of great questions and really good discussion this morning. If there's one piece of advice that you could give to people that have dialed in this morning around how to start to tackle developing business cases, what would it be? And I am, Adrian, you're smiling at me, so I'm going to come to you first.
Well, yeah, so my favourite film is Apollo 13. And there's a great line in it where he says, work the problem. And the problems are with what is going on within your communities now. If you focus on those problems, then the value is in solving those problems. So focus on place, focus on your businesses, focus on your people, focus on your communities, and you will end up delivering value. And if you deliver value, you'll end up with a viable business case.
Brilliant answer. Thank you, Adrian. Sam, I'm going to come to you next.
Actually, can you come back to me? I'm just thinking about it. Sorry.
Okay, yeah, no worries, John. You're in the hot seat.
Okay, I would say look at where money is being spent at the moment, where money is being invested in this space, and work with those organisations that are spending money to see how you can actually do it more efficiently collectively.
Brilliant.
So I'll come back to utilities and other organisations.
Yeah, I think it's a really difficult one because I'm like torn between the two. One is the technology being a proposition to reduce costs, right, and allows us to develop things better. And the other side is very much, we want to build that foundation infrastructure to enable innovation and drive productivity and all of that sort of stuff. So I don't actually know, I would say. We're still trying to work that out as we develop.
Journey.
Yeah, still on the journey. So sorry for a bit of a cop-out answer, but you probably don't hear local authorities say we don't know very often, but there we go.
No, but that's kind of the point of these discussions, right? To be really honest about kind of where we are and the fact that we're all on that journey. John, Sam, Adrian, thank you so much. That's been such a great conversation. And also thank you for all the attendees. Brilliant questions coming in. We've really put people through their paces, which is great. Just a few final points I wanted to just kind of mention before we close. So for those of you who aren't familiar with the UK 5G site, we have a dedicated section on the site. You can see the URL at the bottom of the screen there, all about how to deploy digital connectivity and infrastructure in places. It enables you to explore 5G projects and initiatives that are taking place in your region, and it's full of kind of practical insights, guides, assets. We've got some talking heads videos on there as well, people sharing their kind of their journeys, their insights, the things that they've tried that didn't work, the things that they tried that have worked. So I really do recommend you have a look at that. There is a dedicated page on DCIA within that. We've talked about that this morning, so it's worth having a look on that. And then the final piece to leave you with is that this event is the first in a series of events we're running this month, dedicated to kind of local authorities, regional authorities, LEPs, people that are making decisions, leading and making places, essentially. So next Thursday morning at 9:30, we've got an introduction to Open RAN, what it is, why it matters, what you need to understand about it, and how that fits into the broader kind of government strategy. And then on Wednesday the 20th, we are holding a networking session. So this will be on the Remo platform. For those of you who've not come across that one yet, it's a virtual networking space, and it's really designed to provide a forum for places to come together, to have discussions, similar to the ones that we've had this morning, to share kind of what are you struggling with, what are the successes you've had, what advice can you share, what top tips can you get from other places. So we've got good registration numbers for both of those, but if you haven't already registered and you'd like to, then please do. All of the details are on the UK 5G site. They should prove to be another, similar today, kind of really engaging discussion and a good forum to share best practices. So the final thing for me to say is thank you so much for all your time and contributions this morning. We will be sharing the slides with you all afterwards. We'll also be sharing a feedback survey. If you have 2 minutes to fill that in, please do. It just helps us to make sure that the content and the events that we're producing for you are valuable and are covering the topics that you want to cover. Thank you so much. I will let you all get to your days and to start mainstreaming the news again, given that it all seems to be happening today. So thank you very much to John, Sam and Adrian in particular, and we will see you all soon. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.